special guests who've come in today who aren't necessarily members of Polyphony. We're glad to have you with us today. I'm Kyle Dameron, and I'm a co-host for Polyphony with Doug Haney, who's at Wilshire Baptist in Dallas. I'm here at Kirkwood Baptist Church in St. Louis, and I've been staying home most this week in the mornings because it's snowy and icy here. So I'm enjoying working from home, especially this week. As many of you received an email from me this past week related to this meeting today, I basically shared with you the general idea of this meeting related to the topic that's been rather a hot topic in the last year or two in the choral music world, especially namely among music educators, and it's related to cultural appropriation, especially the whole matter of predominantly white member choirs singing spirituals. But that topic namely has been focused on the traditional spirituals, but the debate most certainly can include other genres of music, of course. And Doug Haney and myself and Terry met last week. We've been talking about this between each other for several weeks, months, in fact, for Terry and Doug. And we believe that whether or not this entire matter is one you're encountering within your ministry or have encountered, it is a relevant issue to hear more about, to carefully consider and discuss together. And also the issue could come up in your different contexts eventually, especially if you have music educators who sing or play an instrument in your ministry, or you're a part of a community chorus, or and if you do a variety of musical genres that are outside your cultural identity and cultural understanding. So Doug and I have invited Terry to introduce our special guest today. Terry's not really a stranger to many of us. Terry, I'll remind you, is serving as chair of visual and performing arts at Clayton State University in Atlanta. And he's a life member of the American Choral Directors Association, has served as the national chair for music and worship. And he's currently the national chair for lifelong singing. And so Terry's has feet in both worlds of church music and music academia. And so we're really glad to have Terry as the person that can introduce us to Roger Holland today. Terry.
Thanks, Kyle, and hi, everybody. It's great to be back in the Polyphony world again, and I really appreciate the invitation to share with you a person that I just admire so much. Roger Holland and I were introduced in New York City. So many of you are my longtime friends, and you may remember that in the early 2000s, I spent several years conducting in New York City, and I was a member of the Riverside Church, where I became friends with the pastor, Dr. James Forbes, and his wife, Betty Forbes, who is a choral director and quite an accomplished musician. And Betty directed a professional gospel choir in New York called the Ebony Ecumenical Ensemble. And they were having an anniversary year concert, maybe their 25th anniversary, I think. And she said to me, would you come to our dress rehearsal and write notes and let me know what you hear? And so I, of course, was eager to go and hear the group. And just before they broke for a rehearsal break, an intermission, they sang this piece that just blew me away. And it was a setting of the prayer of St. Francis, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. And I said to Betty, the choir is beautiful and I don't have any notes for you to improve the choir, but I have to know about that piece of music. Please tell me about Lord, make me an instrument. And she said, well, he wrote it. And she pointed to the pianist. And there at the piano was Roger Holland accompanying the Ebony Ecumenical Ensemble. So I ran up and just shook his hand, and said, I want to meet you. I love that piece. Well, 12 years later, I'd been in Birmingham by this time, 10 or 11 years, and the Gospel Music Workshops of America, which is a professional organization for church musicians that's quite large, has annual conventions that run to like 20,000 participants. They were coming to Birmingham for their convention, and one of their board members, Tony Leach from Penn State, was in town and called, and we had lunch, and he said, we have a concert in the community at these workshops, and we're going to have it at historic 16th Street Baptist Church. We invite one of the local choirs to join our director's chorus in this concert. How about your chamber choir? So I was very excited, and we paired with the Birmingham Chamber Chorus to share that concert. And lo and behold, one of the directors of that concert and soloist was Roger Holland. And we were, in our program was, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. And so it was a night I'll never forget, getting to converse with Roger, perform that piece with him there. And so when Doug called me a few months ago and we started talking about this question, it was in the context of the Black Lives Matter protests that were sweeping the country, of the incidents of violence against Black young men that we were seeing across the country. I now teach in a predominantly Black institution where this is part of our everyday conversation. And when Doug asked about it, the first person who came to my mind was Roger Holland. I said, you don't need to know my opinion about it. We need to go to someone whose opinion carries the weight of experience and scholarship. And so I asked Roger about it. And in fact, he's written an article about this question that we'll be publishing in the Choral Journal in the next week or two, next month or two. But meanwhile, we have the privilege of having him here today. So after that long introduction, here's Roger Holland, who's a grad of Westminster Choir College, Manhattan School of Music, Union Theological Seminary, who teaches at the great University of Denver in a special project that that university has that works on the preservation and performance of spirituals. His list of accomplishments includes playing in the orchestra pit on Broadway. It includes working with some of the greatest musicians in the country. And today we get to be with him. So Roger, with that introduction, let me just lob the question to you, and you just give us what you have to say about it. And that question is, to what extent are the music that come from the Black church traditions, the spirituals, the gospel music, and that kind of thing, universal enough in their appeal that someone whose choir or congregation are predominantly white might feel comfortable or uncomfortable in utilizing that music as part of their own worship planning?
Wow. First, let me say thank you to Terry and all of those here at Polyphony for the very warm welcome and the invitation to share and to speak with you today. I have to say, with our pre-session conversation and that introduction, I'm just overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. I was gonna say how to feel. I know how I feel. I feel very blessed and humbled and overwhelmed, and I'm just swelling. I don't try to come back down and try to be productive with you in this moment. Listening to our conversation thus far and thinking about things, I guess what I can start by saying is, in terms of spirituals, I teach a lot about this music and this community and these ideas at the university right now. And one of the texts I use is by the founder of the Spirituals Project, which I'm the director of, whose mission, as Terry just said, is beyond simply the music, but it's about preserving and restoring and educating people in terms of the music's history and the source community. And so that aspect is very important. But one Arthur Jones, who's the founder of the group, wrote a book called Wade in the Water. And in that text, he talks about the universality of the spirituals. And what he says is that there are universal themes, universal emotions that make the spirituals accessible and relatable to people outside of the African American community. Things like joy and sorrow and suffering, hope, are not unique to the African American experience. And we can all relate to what that means. Disappointment, loss. Those are not unique experiences and emotions to the African American community. And so much, therefore, of the music is relatable and accessible. And I think the community wants to share these stories and these songs with the broader global community. Two things that I focus on, and this goes to the issue, I guess, or the topic of appropriation and appropriateness for those outside of the community. And I've been doing some research on that as well. And the big takeaways that I've gotten in reading the scholarship of others is that appropriation happens when people outside of the culture, the tradition, the community take this music or the culture of another as their own without giving due recognition to the source community. And that means you don't acknowledge that it comes from a particular community. You don't recognize that it's steeped in a tradition and certain cultural norms and idiomatic characteristics. You don't honor or respect the source community by recognizing the place that these cultural treasures hold in that community. And in the really extreme cases, there is economic rape that takes place. That's a harsh word, but when you claim the music of your own and you don't give the due financial recompense or royalties and so forth. This was probably the most blatant during the 50s and the 60s, when we had in our country something called race records, where people, record companies and producers and agents really pilfered the intellectual property of Black artists, where they would record the songs of other artists, Black artists, and not pay royalties on that. Record companies would literally steal the royalties. They would have artists sign these contracts that were just immoral. And people, there are stories of so many rock and roll artists, blues artists that died penniless because they did not reap the benefits of their own work. And so when those kinds of things happen, that's when it's, problematic. But even folks like Elvis Presley and other artists have given due recognition to what Little Richard would call the architects of this music, the originators, the creators, the authors, the composers, the performers. When that is done, we see a lot of this in jazz music as well. Non-Black jazz artists recognize that this music came from the Black community. So there are two things I'll say about two genres that come from African-American culture and tradition, those being the Negro spirituals. And I like to call them the Negro spirituals because it reminds us of the history of this music and the evolution of this music. So the Negro spirituals and then Black gospel music. And I make that distinction because there is Southern white music or gospel. And unfortunately, our country has made these distinctions. That's why we refer to one form of Christian music as CCM and another as urban gospel. And we can talk more about that. But the two things I would like to highlight, and I guess we can open the floor for questions. And one of the things that I'm focusing on in my own teaching and scholarship right now are two areas I think that if we hold those in mind, it helps us to be authentic in our approach and understanding to this music. For the spirituals, it is now my contention that you cannot discuss this music without understanding that it comes from suffering. If you don't acknowledge the suffering of the source community, then you cannot fully understand the music of the Negro spiritual. It's ensconced in suffering. It was created out of suffering. Even the joyful spirituals are related to suffering. I mean, just think about this. If you are in deep pain and suffering with an acute case of cancer, and somebody threw you a birthday party. Yes, you might smile and laugh, but your body is still aching. How can you ignore the pain that you are experiencing even in a joyful moment? It is still there. You know, it doesn't evaporate just because of a pleasant, joyful moment. And so even joyful, jubilant spirituals are still ensconced in suffering. So we must acknowledge that and find a way to connect to that ethos. The second thing that I talk about, so another term that I use when I'm talking to my students is the socio-historic context of the music. The spirituals emerged within the socio-historic context of slavery, the antebellum South. So we have to remember that of this music. They are religious folk songs that emerged during the crucible of slavery. In terms of Black gospel music, and therefore the spirituals, excuse me, let me go back. Therefore the spirituals are commentaries. Many scholars, Wyatt T. Walker, James Cone, who's a former teacher of mine, talk about the spirituals as being historical documents and commenting on what is going on sociologically with the community, with the Black community. The same would hold true with gospel music. Wyatt T. Walker says that what's going on with the Black community socially, or what you hear them singing in their religious songs, reflects and is a comment on what's going on with the community socially. So again, the socio-historic context. Gospel music emerged during the period of the Great Depression in this country. And therefore, fundamentally, and this is not, you know, an all and nothing else kind of idea here, always and never, you know, I try to have my students never focus or embrace absolutes. That just doesn't exist. So certainly there are other foci for Black gospel music, but we can't ignore the fact that fundamentally, much of it comes from the idea of hope, addressing the sense of hopelessness within the Black community. So it emerged in the late 20s, early 30s during the period of the Great Depression in our country. I mentioned to my students that it has been said that when white America has a cold, Black America has pneumonia or the flu. We get impacted much more severely, which has been evinced by recent events with the coronavirus. Communities of color have been more adversely impacted by the coronavirus. What has been highlighted is health disparities, economic disparities, political disparities within communities of color. The infection rates have been much more severe, 2, 3, 4 times as much. The same thing happened during the Great Depression. And so what was probably of great importance to the Black community, particularly within their religious environments, was a message of hope, to know that God was able to deliver. God was able to make a way out of no way. That's why some of the early gospel songs talk about when I was down to my last dime, when there was no food on my table. I know that God is able. I know the Lord will make a way somehow. That is the context, that is the text of early gospel music. And while it certainly is broader than that, praise to God, scriptural texts, in the history and the formation of this music, it was important to the Black community to know that we had a God that was able. That was the most important thing. God is able to do the things that we cannot do. God is able to deliver. God is able to save. God is able to provide. Those are the messages. And since some has changed, but so much is still the same. And so those messages are still salient. They still resonate. They are still so important. So if you're going to sing this music, the biggest offense, I would say, is when people sing this without an understanding of what it means to the community. When you don't connect to the hardship that is the source of much of this music, then you do it a disservice because you're not getting to the heart of the music. But I don't think most African American musicians or people in the community would say, we don't want anybody else to sing the music. But when it becomes something that is frivolous or doesn't make sense or dishonors the suffering, therein lies the issue. Therein lies the problem. You know, when somebody makes light of your suffering, that's a generality, but you understand what I'm saying, then you feel hurt and you feel offended. So I think if we can connect to the suffering of the Black community, which is still at issue in 2021, then I think we minimize the risk of offending, we minimize the risk of doing damage, we minimize the risk of doing something that is inappropriate. The last thing I will say, and then we can have a discussion, is in these conversations that I've been having since the summer, which was really fraught, and I will also add, was very traumatic for many of us in the Black community. And I was being called upon about these issues of appropriation and diversity a lot. At a certain point, it just became a lot for me to have to keep revisiting the same issues. But one of the things that I've said, particularly to my fellow musicians, is that the same attention that you would give to Bach and to Beethoven and to Brahms, you study the language, you look at the Latin, you look at the German, you're very attentive. We are very attentive to the pronunciation, talking about the culture, looking at the history of the composers. Often that same amount of attention, knowing what is idiomatically characteristic of the period, you wouldn't perform your Bach like you would do your Brahms. So that same kind of attention to musical detail should be paid to music of the African American experience. So often people throw it off like, oh, this is just an easy folk song and we just have at it. But no. The same amount of detail should be. You need to do the research. You need to talk to people who are experts in the field and have, experience with the music. You need to listen to recordings to get a sense of what the sound is like, what's important. Read, do the scholarship. So, that should be the same approach. Approach this music that is not familiar to you or things that you're not steeped in, the same way. We've all spent, those of us who went in conservatory, we took classes, we've studied the periods of music, and we've seen the evolution and the development. We know what makes Schoenberg and Shostakovich and Prokofiev different from Debussy and Ravel. We know these things. So know the difference between Moses Hogan and Jester Hairston, understand what is different between a Marcus Garrett and a Hall Johnson, or a James Cleveland and a Kirk Franklin. We should know these things because this is our art, this is our craft, this is our vocation, this is what we are called to do, this is what we've committed, this is what we are about, this is our ministry. So there we go.
Well, thank you so much, Roger. I feel like I'm evolving, as I listen to you. It's just so helpful to hear you discuss these things and give us more focus in our thoughts about them. I think many of us on this call, frankly, we're people who grew up in the Deep South in the Southern Baptist tradition, and we deal a lot in the back of our minds with the shame of that, having been founded as a pro-slavery religious movement, 150 years ago. So it's part of our personal evolution to talk about this with you and to love this music, to study it like we've studied other music, and to help our congregations evolve through the use of this music. And I just appreciate that so much. I'm curious about one very practical thing, and that is with spirituals. Um, I'm working right now on a printed program for a national conference event in which a wonderful group of spiritual singers from Atlanta are presenting the spiritual Fix Me Jesus. They're doing it they're doing it off any printed music. They're harmonizing with each other. They're all professional opera singers. It's a beautiful thing, and it's a virtual conference. So of course, I've already got the video of them doing it. So I'm preparing the printed handout for it. What do I call it? Because I really resonate with the honor that's being shown through the use of the word Negro spiritual to those forebears who produce that music. And yet I'm aware there are people who haven't thought about that angle who would be offended by the use of that rather archaic term. And so I see people use the term African American spiritual, and I'm a little offended by that because I view those people as enslaved Africans. I think it kind of whitewashes them to say they're African American if they're not being given citizenship rights, but rather are enslaved. So my question is, what would you do? How would you ascribe that in a printed program?
Wow, that is in some ways a loaded question. It's not that loaded, but it's so pertinent. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot, wrestling with a lot. I've been in conversation with some other scholars about, and there is no agreement. People within the Black community have different thoughts about this. Professionals who are published and publish or have arrangements published have different thoughts on this. One person who I've had conversation with is Eileen Gunther, who released a book about almost 5 years ago in their own words. And she uses probably the first scholar to talk about this music involved slave narratives and using the slave narratives to inform her thinking and her scholarship. I have talked about this. One reason that it became an issue or a thing for me that I'm working currently, my work has been postponed, put on the shelf for a moment, but I wanted to write an article about this, what to call, what nomenclature should be used. And it got prompted by a concert I attended, a choral music concert, where the spirituals were listed as American spirituals or just spirit. I think it was American spiritual. And that left me fuming in the audience. I couldn't get out of that concert fast enough. And it was for the reasons that you just said. Again, you know, I talk about this music all the time. I'm teaching about it. I emphasize to my students that, just as you said, the Africans that were enslaved in this country had no rights, and they were legally denied citizenship. It's in the Constitution, and via decisions by the Supreme Court. And so when they talk about Blacks in this country before 1865, and they say African Americans, I always correct them. I say, no, enslaved Africans, because we were denied citizenship. We were not citizens until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Therefore, historically and legally, it is incorrect to refer to Black people in this country as African Americans. We were defined as property by virtue of our skin color. And so here's the thing. I started to think about, well, academically and in circles of scholarship, what is the politically correct term or the appropriate term to refer to Blacks that grew up in this country who have citizenship as African Americans, as opposed to African immigrants or Caribbean Americans and so forth, people within the diaspora who have African ancestry. But at the same time, and so from a scholastic point, I felt that that was an appropriate term and an adequate term to refer to the music as African American spirituals. But in talking with Eileen, we both really felt, and I kind of was in the middle, to be honest. I felt that in printed and in scholarship work, I would use the term African American spirituals because it was less incendiary. provocative is a better word. It was less provocative. It was in some ways safe. And that is the term that is accepted and in wide use in scholarship and in academia. But I still would have referred to them as I did today, as Negro spirituals whenever I would talk about the music, because I insist that it's important to remember the history. And using the term Negro invokes that. You cannot talk about Negro spirituals and not understand the socio-historic context, which I think is so important. And in talking with Eileen about that, she affirmed that. She said, Roger, I don't think we should call them African-American spirituals. They were Negro spirituals then, they should be Negro spirituals now. And we need to contend with this. And so, but at the same time, I'm not insensitive or oblivious to the provocativeness, particularly in your geographic location, where this history is fraught with stuff. So I would say the brave way to do it is to go ahead and call them Negro spirituals. But even African Americans are torn with there is no agreement. At this moment, I will not call names, but I've spoken with some very prominent people who have well-known arrangements of spirituals today. And when I ask them about it, the response is, well, why do we need to do that? Everybody knows the history. There's no need to do that. Let's just call them spirituals. Everybody knows what they are. And I disagree. And so, I'm eventually just going to put it out there. And, I know when you put it in writing, everybody sees, not everybody will agree. And some people will have issue and they will attack you. And I guess I just have to be prepared for that. So I guess I don't have a specific answer for you, except to give you of the argument.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. That does help me. And I'll tell you, I've posed the exact same question to two people that I consider very, very prominent African-American conductors and are close friends, and neither one has answered. So I really do appreciate your comments about how there's really no agreement on it. And I'll have to make a decision on it in the next day or two. And I'm a little bit inclined that if I'm going to be brave and incendiary, I may put in the program enslaved African spiritual.
What I would prefer you do is put slave songs or music of the slave tradition or something like that. Yeah, that it's a little more encompassing, and it's also accurate. I forget. I can't remember. I think it was McKinley, William McKinley. I should remember. My memory's not as great as others. But the first notated group of spirituals was recorded by what we would call today ethnomusicologists, and it's William. I just have to look it up because I should know this. But it was the first published, written down recording of the melodies of the spirituals was by these scholars. It's called Slave Songs in 1867.
Interesting. Well, I've taken up so much time, so I want to direct your attention to the chat where there are questions coming in, and that might be the most efficient way for us to ask you to reflect on these questions from David Tang and then from Carrie Cannon.
Are we supposed to ask them out loud? Sorry.
Yeah, if they're hard to see, we'll just have them ask out loud.
Yeah, so Roger, I've done a couple presentations on spirituals, and I've struggled with the scholarship on when, where, and how they were first created. So one of the things when I moved to the South and saw slave galleries in white churches, that confused me because I would imagine it'd be hard to sing a spiritual in the slave gallery when you were in white church. So where did they get created? When did they get created? So were people singing spirituals when they first arrived in the 1600s or 1700s or 1800s when cotton exploded? So my theory is that when cotton became king and slaves couldn't fit in the slave galleries because there were so many more slaves, they started worshiping in praise houses and bush meetings, And that's when they started creating them. But a lot of people say they were created in the fields as work songs. But I don't necessarily, I see them as more complex than being a just simple call and answer, like, where do you have any insight into when, where, and how?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things my education and my research has taught me, and this applies even to classical music, sometimes we forget these things. There are no even though we were taught that like the Baroque music started in 1685 and it ended in 1750, we know this is not true. We ascribe it to Bach. Music evolves, and what we see is that at a certain point, some things became more systematic. This became the established practice of the day. Moving from what was the practice during what we call the Baroque period, there was a transition that eventually emerged with what we would call the classical period, Romantic, and so forth and so on. The same holds true for this music. So the first thing I will say is that, and this goes back to an answer I gave Terry a moment ago, the slave songs of the enslaved community encompass more than just the religious folk songs. There are the work songs, there were moans and groans, there's jubilee, there's field hollers. So all of that is part of the slave songs of the African community. The other thing I think is important to note is that the enslaved community had no common language when they were brought here. And so it wouldn't have been until you had probably a generation or two of enslaved Africans where they were comfortable, and now the English language was their common tongue, if you would. And so 1619, no spirituals. Probably as late as the early 1700s, we're maybe beginning to start to see this music emerge. It's going to take some time for the community to imbibe Christianity, hearing the biblical stories and the Protestant Christian hymns. So it's not until all of these things coalesce that you're going to start to see the religious folk songs start to emerge. Yeah. So it's in the context of all of that that you're going to see these religious folk songs. Something's happening. Maybe this is. You hear that echo? There you go.
Everybody mute.
Yeah.
I think it's Kenneth's phone.
Okay.
Yeah, if everybody will be sure you're muted unless you're speaking, that's what's called.
Okay, that feels a little better. So David, we're not going to see probably the emergence of what we know now and call now the spirituals until I would say the mid 18th century, or the early to mid 18th century, all the way up until emancipation. The spiritual "Oh Freedom" that says, "Before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave." Most scholars would agree that text would probably not be sung during the middle of the slavery period. That is something that is so revolutionary. It was probably a song that was created near the end of slavery or right at the end of slavery. So yeah, we're talking probably a period of about 100 years that this music existed formally, but it wouldn't have begun until the slaves had grasp of the English language.
And do you think they were created in those bush meetings, those hidden bush meetings and prayer houses where they were separate from their owners, but not in a work situation, but in a worship situation?
I think they were created in both of those. I think they were created in both of those. We know that as a matter of practice, music of this period was very much ensconced in African culture and tradition and its spontaneity. And I I could definitely see that maybe during working in the fields, a work song kind of a flavor. Soon one morning, death come creeping in my room. They could have just, somebody might have just thought that and started singing. And then it caught on, and then the people around them, somebody else, 20 feet away. I'm so glad I got my religion in time. And then they liked it so much that night, somebody started singing in the brush arbor, in the visible institution. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, what shall I do? And wherever there was a need, people would have started to sing. Doesn't matter.
Thank you so much, Roger. Carrie, you want to jump in and ask about performance practice?
Yeah, I was, oddly enough, I was working on my degree with Marcus Garrett. We would spend a lot of chit chat time in the break room at UNC Greensboro. And it was then that my white self realized there was this whole other world. Like all it was for me was ACDA and Choristers Guild, right? And then I realized there were other conventions that were happening nationally that I was wholly unaware of. And yet, I grew up in churches and in colleges singing these spirituals and the Moses Hogans and, doing the best that we could with performance practice. But I was fascinated to know that there was this whole other world out there, other conventions to attend. And I want to do that. And so I kind of would love to know, what are those that we might register for and go and attend? That of course, right now we're living in a different time, but where are those other places we can go to? Where can we read? What are recordings or ensembles that we can look to for guidance for this performance practice? It's finding the appropriate means by which we can offer this up authentically, and providing the proper sources for the meaning behind and the style in which we are singing these spirituals.
Certainly. I don't know that there are regular conferences that deal with spirituals. Certainly, different organizations have their regular conferences. From time to time, a specific conference may come up that is not an annual event. So I would say just look for those when they crop up. At my institution, University of Denver, with the Spirituals Project, we're endeavoring to hold a triennial national conference that will deal with the music of the spirituals, the history, and all kinds of other things. We had one scheduled for May 2020, but all things went the way of the dodo during coronavirus. So we had to cancel our conference too. I was very disappointed, worked very hard for that, but we had to postpone and probably won't look to mount the same or mount that conference again until 2022. So that will become a triennial conference. The Hampton Ministers Conference that goes on every year in June is a place where this music is discussed and approached, performance practice. The Gospel Music Workshop of America that Terry mentioned earlier is another annual conference where these kinds of things go on. But aside from that, there's no specific place that I could point you to. It's whenever people get together and say, I want to present something on this. To my knowledge, there's no annual conference besides those few that come about on a regular basis like that, on an annual basis. There is a conference coming up, I think either later this month or next month, that is going to deal with the spirituals and performance practice on music of the African American tradition. And I'll research that and send Terry the information so he can share it with the rest of the group. But those kinds of conferences, they just, there are some other specific ones. I know my faith tradition is Roman Catholic, and there is a Black Catholic conference that happens every year called the Archbishop Andrew Lyke Conference. but we deal more so with liturgical matters, liturgical concerns dealing with the Black Catholic community, so that's a little different. But I just mentioned that as by way of saying these are some annual conferences, but for the things that you're talking about, there are really only two. Oh, and there's another one. There's the Thomas Dorsey conference that he started, called the National Conference of Gospel Choirs. Is a broader name. Again, I'm literal things. I'm not the best, but I can write it out. If you Google Thomas Dorsey National Convention, it'll come up.
And you've mentioned Wade in the Water by Arthur
Jones.
In their own words, was that right? By Eileen Gunter?
Yes.
Any others that stand out to you?
Way over in Beulah Land, Andre Thomas. Somebody's Calling My Name by Wyatt T. Walker. I'm trying to think what else. There are a few others. I recommend there are texts by scholars like Melanie Burnham and the Eileen Southern, which is African American music in general, but she talks about this music. Melanie Burnham and Portia Maltsby have written a book.
Wonderful. Maybe we can put together a resource list. That's a great question, Kerry.
Yeah.
Adam Cogliano has written a really interesting question in the chat. And basically, Roger, he's asking that even within the context of having studied the history, having done the things that you were recommending earlier about contextualizing the spiritual, are there lyrics or themes that really still might cross a line? And he mentions a spiritual with imagery like a bullwhip in the hand, or I'm going to kill you, or something like that in the lyrics, and wonders, would that really still be crossing the line? Predominantly white choir were to sing it.
Yeah, that is kind of dicey. Those lyrics come from what is actually not a spiritual, but I would call a work song, Great God Almighty. And a local colleague of mine offered to sing that at a conference that we were hosting, actually a spiritual festival. And I mentioned, first of all, it wasn't a spiritual, but it is one of the slave songs, a slave folk song. Famous arrangements, I'm not aware of any others at the moment, but the first one, and what I'm most familiar with, is the Jester Hairston arrangement. And then there is Stacey Gibbs, who is probably the successor to Moses Hogan in terms of the popularity of spiritual arrangements. And I performed that, but the Spirituals Project is a multicultural, multi-ethnic group. And we wrestled with that. I programmed the piece for us to do. Yeah, and essentially the song, Great God Almighty, is about a slave beating. It is about an overseer or a slave master, captain, who is beating a slave to within an inch of his life. And the community is pleading. That's what Great God Almighty is. It is a prayer, a plead. Please don't kill this guy. Please don't kill him, Lord. And I can see where that might be problematic for an all-white choir to sing. I see an educational value. And what I did when we performed, we only got to perform it a few times. We got it at the beginning of our season before COVID. It was in last year's repertoire. I prefaced the song with an explanation about what it was, and asked people to listen to the lyrical content. And to be honest and to be clear, there was a heaviness in the room during the performance and immediately after. Some of my choir members felt that it was probably inappropriate for people to applaud. They said, we don't think people should be clapping after this. And I told them, no, this is a performance situation, but I think we allow people to process this. And there was a pause, people had to really take that in because the weight of what that was. So I would say if an all-white choir was to perform that, it needs to be with the understanding of what that piece is about. Again, it's not a spiritual, it's more of a work song. I say work song because of the pulse of that song, which is that strong two. Not all spirituals that invoke the name of God or Jesus are religious in nature. There are other we have to also recall that the slave community, the enslaved Africans, coming from their African cosmology, had no distinction between what Western philosophy deems as sacred and secular. Everything is spiritual inherently in African, at least historically, in African culture and cosmology. God and spirituality was present in everything. And so it didn't matter that you mentioned God, that did not distinguish a piece of music from being religious or being non-religious, sacred or secular. So yeah, if you were to do the song, I would say it would be very important that you educate your audience as to what this is and to not ignore the gravity of what you're singing.
Thank you so much. Warren Howell has asked a question related to the word we've used earlier in the conversation, evolution. And he says, what among the characteristics of the spirituals has undergone the most change in recent practice and maybe is changing still? And I think he's talking about especially performance practice. How has it changed and how are the songs evolving?
These are some really great questions. I appreciate these. Again, not an easy answer. So in my estimation, where I'm thinking right now, and what these questions are helping me to realize is that it's important for me to have conversations with others, my peers who are engaging in this music. And one of the criticisms and observations by one of my colleagues is what he feels, and I would agree with him, in many ways, there is kind of a departure from the essence of this music in terms of the written down arrangements, which the language I would use is what we see is an emergence more of composition. And let me put that in context and explain. So I'd like to go back to the writings in the early 20th century, early 1900s by Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote an article about what she calls the neo-spiritual, the new spiritual. And she makes a distinction between what she would call the authentic or the genuine spiritual and the arranged or the concert spiritual, and that being the neo-spiritual, which really would have begun with the Fisk Jubilee Singers. So the Fisk Jubilee Singers, a group of college students that were formed by their white choir director to raise money for their school, Fisk University, or the Fisk School at that time. And these were trained singers who were very reluctant initially to sing the music of their forebears for a couple of reasons. We have to understand that this music was initially only sung for and by the enslaved community. This was not music meant for an audience. This was music that was intended to inspire and to sustain that specific community. So no one really outside of the overseers and the slave masters had ever heard this music before. So in some ways, this was very personal to them. It was private. It was an expression of their personal sorrow and pain and hurt, right? Also, a great many, especially those who were aspiring to become more assimilated into American culture, there was a sense of shame, a sense of embarrassment about this music, and a desire to distance themselves from this music and the history of slavery, because they felt it was demeaning. And so there were those dynamics, right? So now, post-slavery, we have two different mediums of singing this music. There is the authentic rendering of this music in community and or congregation, where it is unrehearsed, where it is spontaneous, where there is no formality to it, right? And then we have formal presentation of this music on concert stages, both by soloists, people like Marian Anderson and Roland Hayes, and college choirs singing arrangements by Hall Johnson and William Dawson and the like, right? John W. Work. And so we start to see arrangements of folk tunes. Now, where we start to get into some questions about the authenticity of these arrangements is when they lose their inherent folk nature. So I would say those, and the argument by one of my friends and colleagues is that those earlier arrangers maintain the essence of the folk nature of this music, yeah? But what we have seen, and some have even criticized Moses Hogan for this, that later arrangements, especially within our younger composers, right, who are seeking to flex and exercise their compositional muscles, are leaving the essence of the music and the melodies of this music. And they have become arguably compositions. So what I would say, this is what I've seen in the evolution, if you would. We seem to have gotten away from the folk nature of the music. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, right? I'm just talking about what I see. There's a complexity of harmonic language that we would not see. One of the criticisms or the observations, if you would, by Zora Neale Hurston is the Europeanization of this music, right? So the use of the Western classical musical approach to this music, and in some ways she feels that dilutes the authenticity and the origin of the music. It's losing some of its Africanness, its African American, its roots. And so I've even seen a few published arrangements that are called arrangements that I really feel are compositions, wherein I don't even see the melody of the spiritual. Some of the text of the original spiritual is there, but this is really a composition, and I think it should be called that. This is Wade in the Water based on, or this is God's going to trouble the water based on the theme of Wade in the Water, but it's really not Wade in the Water. I'm making things up because I just don't want to call things out right now, but there's a piece in particular I think of. This is an original composition that was inspired by the spiritual. The melody is not even there. So how can you call this that particular spiritual? So that's what I have to say. I see an evolution that is more compositional. And again, I don't say this is a bad thing, but I just think we need to be clear on what this music is. And the further away we go from the folk nature, the essence, the rhythms of the original folk tune, the more it becomes a composition. A lot of the earlier arrangements by the masters, Margaret Bonds, Dawson, Evelyn LaRue Pittman, I think. A lot of that uses Negro dialect, and that's a whole nother, right? Certainly, I think the more recent arrangements will use more formal, grammatically correct English. And there's nothing wrong with that either. The Johnson brothers have written about this in the beginning of their text, the 2 volumes of spirituals that they have put together. So there's nothing wrong with that. But those are the kinds of things that I see happening in terms of the evolution and performance practice. One thing I will say, so this gets a little dicey and I'm feeling a little more comfortable, so I'll just go ahead and say it. when we have non-Black composers or non-African American composers doing arrangements, setting these folk tunes, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times I find the arrangements to be inauthentic in this sense. The essence of the spiritual is not there. The rhythmic aspect is not there. The harmonic language is not there. An understanding of slavery and the source community is not there. This is someone who likes the tune and has written an arrangement, but it's not ensconced in the tradition, and it doesn't reflect what I know to be the tradition. And so it seems to lack some authenticity. So there's that too. When you see some of, and they become these wonderful choral pieces, you know, with 8-10 harmony, part harmony, multiple divises, beautiful lyricism. But Wendell Whalum, this is a wonderful article to read, by the way. It's called Black Hymnody by Wendell Whalum. And he talks about the essence of the spiritual. And one of the things he emphasizes is the rhythmic nature of this music. You have to remember that African music is very rhythmic and very dependent and symbiotic with the drum. Drums are part of African music and culture and music making. And if you lose, Roland Carter has said, even if a spiritual is slow, you still have this essence of the two, the hard two in it. And some of these pieces that become these art songs, I think they just lose that. It's like, where is the spiritual in that? You know, so you've taken this music and you've created a composition, but the essence of what the music is just, it's not there, it's gone.
Thank you. Kyle, I don't know when you feel like you need to call time, so I don't want to just keep going now that we've reached noon.
Yeah, I could sit here all day, in fact, because it's snowy outside and I'm enjoying this conversation very much. And Roger, I'm also trying to be mindful of your time. I know you've got something else to do today, another meeting. How are you?
I could do another half hour if people would like. It's
okay. And I'm recording this, so if you need to exit anyone, we're not going to perceive that as rude at all. We know that you've got other things you might need to tend to. We usually end by this time, but we'll just keep it going and we'll make the recording available. I'll make it available as soon as possible. I've lost track of which.
I think we're at Doug's question. Roger, Doug Haney, whom you met prior to the meeting, has kind of framed the original question, which started out in our discussion of gospel music, but he's framed it related more to spirituals. And so he asks, assuming the lyrics of a Negro spiritual are appropriate for the liturgy of the day, do you have any concerns about a primarily white choir singing that genre of worship? And he gives the examples like Ride On King Jesus, which you frequently hear on Palm Sunday, or Keep Your Lamps by Andre, which you know, is a very, very ubiquitous setting done by choirs everywhere. Any qualms about predominantly white choirs using those as liturgical vehicles in worship?
not at all, not at all. Just the things I've said, you know, study the music, study the idioms. If you perform it in an authentic manner, please, you know, sing it.
And you mentioned dialect, and dialect comes into play sometimes in those arrangements, but in even the solo settings like Harry Burleigh's famous book of spiritual solo settings. One of our questioners, Candy McComb, has asked about her high school students feeling uneasy about singing using the dialect that is spelled for them by composers like Harry Burleigh. And they, of course, are acting out of a sense of their own desire to be aware of what might be offensive. And so How would you respond to that question regarding especially those older arrangements that use dialectical spelling rather than modern usage?
Yeah, that's a difficult situation in that we want to honor what the composer, the arranger has written. And there's a respectability to that. There's an authenticity to that. I, over the summer, attended a wonderful webinar that featured Andre Thomas, Anton Armstrong, and Eileen Gunther. And it was hosted, I think, by Mark Foster. But they discussed this issue of Negro dialect or the dialect in the spirituals. And the bottom answer, or the answer was, the bottom line was, if in doubt, I'm phrasing it now like one of my jazz colleagues used to say, when in doubt, leave it out. But give a little more framework for that. Here's the thing, and this is what I think Andre Thomas said. If you cannot perform the music authentically, using the dialect in a manner that sounds natural, organic, and authentic, then you run the risk, and I'm paraphrasing here, you run the risk of approaching minstrelsy, and that you would not want to do. So if you cannot get it to the point where it feels natural, that it is not caricature, then it would be better to leave it out. If you do the dialect, I would strongly urge you to get with someone who's an expert practitioner in the music and understands the genre really well and can coach you on it, so that it doesn't forced, it doesn't sound put on, it doesn't sound mechanical. I think then it would be authentic, but it's a little bit of a dicey situation. I can imagine if I heard it and was seeing it performed by an all-white choir, if there was a gravitas to it, and by that I mean, the sound felt natural, it felt authentic, it felt like these people knew what they were doing, there was a profundity with the delivery, I think I might be perplexed, because it's kind of like, it would be like listening to a cat bark like a dog. That's very extreme. But if that bark was authentic, where I kind of lost, in theater, we would call it suspended disbelief, right? Or to suspended belief. If it just sounded so real, I think I would have to question my own, whatever's about this situation. So, the sound, the delivery, the performance, the belief, I think I would be hard pressed to argue that, but I think it is a difficult situation. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just scrolling back because there's such good chat going on, and making sure I don't inadvertently skip one of the questions. David Tang, who spoke earlier, has asked what you think about the use of spirituals in Michael Tippett's piece, A Child of Our Time.
I'm not exactly familiar with the piece, so I don't want to comment.
They're very British orchestra. It's part of the big choral orchestral thing. They're very British, so they're not at all authentic, but they're incredibly powerful moments at the end of each segment of the piece, and they're sort of odd. I'd be interested for you to check them out, because they're one of my obstacles to performing the piece, because they're kind of uptight.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah, I'd have to acquaint myself. I wouldn't feel comfortable making a comment without knowing.
Well, thanks. And let me just turn this over to Kyle. I think we've asked every question from the chat. There's just some good chat there where people are also providing resources to one another. But let me turn it over to Kyle, and anybody who has other questions, jump in quickly.
We might have overlooked one. I'm trying to see. David, you were asking, David Tank, should singers try to alter vocal timbre?
That's an interesting question. And with that, I think we're also looking at, I think it's in some ways it's a subjective question. It depends upon personal taste. What I will say, my own personal taste, I prefer darker color and darker timbre. And I think there's a lot of precedence for that. For instance, if we were performing a Russian piece, or a piece that was Tibetan, we wouldn't want to be overly bright, If you were performing the Brahms Requiem, Brahms has such dark colors typically, we hear that rich kind of a sound. So I think there's, a precedence for thinking and wanting to have a darker sound when you're doing the spirituals as opposed to bright. Even a brightly tempoed spiritual would probably want to have a darker color to it. So I think yes, but good vocalism, dark, as we know, doesn't mean in the back of the throat. It just means we modify the vowel shapes a little bit and the coloring, but always good vocal sound and healthy sound, always.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. We're in the chat, there's been some really positive response to your mentioning the spiritual discussion with Andre, Anton, Eileen, and hosted by Mark Lawson. And so I wanted to point that you might enjoy knowing that Mark Lawson, who's the president of E.C. Shermer and Morningstar Publications and several companies under that banner, is a member of Kyle's church choir. And I thought that interesting.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Roger, earlier when you were, when the question was asked about lyrics, and you said as long as there was an appropriate setup prior to performance, that'd be one thing. Do you ever suggest changing or omitting certain words? I'm thinking of Hall Johnson's Ain't Got Time to Die, and there's I keep so busy serving my master. I've always felt like if I'm directing a white choir and we're using that line, it just doesn't feel appropriate.
Particularly given our social, political awareness and where we are, as a nation. And I'm thinking also in terms of inclusive language right now, which is a thing. And I certainly don't mean that pejoratively. It's something that we need to be concerned about, how our language can be oppressive in terms of gender, So within that framework, how we're now rethinking much of what we do, not simply about color and race, but gender and ageism and things of that nature, or at least we ought to be, in my opinion. I think that's a legitimate. And here's another thing: it would not be inappropriate even in the keeping of the spirituals, because first of all, Johnson's Ain't Got Time to Die is actually not a spiritual, but a piece composed in the style of a spiritual. It's an original composition that he wrote, which I'm sure you know. But in the spirituals tradition, it was not uncommon to add lyrics, based upon your situation, your context. And so in the civil rights movement, people added words in the names of people with whom that were their oppressor. And so I think that if you were so moved, and given your particular situation, to change that, there are some church situations where they don't want to sing master because they feel that word is very colonial, and it conjures up other images. So they would change it to Lord and that is actually the intent of the word, not in terms of slave master serving my master, means serving my God. That's what the intent of the lyric is, that I keep so busy doing, because that's what Jesus was referred to as Lord and Master and Savior. And so you could change it to serving my Savior and it would be appropriate. That is the intent of the lyric.
Well done, Kyle. Well done on your chat.
Roger,
Roger, take a look at that last chat. You're getting all kinds of accolades on that one, Kyle.
Oh.
That's just,
make sure all 30 of you, oh, there's just 20 now in the room because some have had to go right now, but make sure you all buy that.
Yes, that is true. As you mentioned, I was like, oh, that's right. I'm part of that family now too.
That's right.
Roger, if I could just say, I think it's evident from these insightful questions and the responses in the chat that this is not just academic for us, but we love this music.
Yeah.
We deeply love it, and we feel that it moves our worship to a place that couldn't have been moved by words alone or perhaps by other musical choices. And so we appreciate so much evolving to greater levels of clarity about our use of this music. And you have just been a great resource to us today. And I hope everyone meeting Roger feels that they now are connected to a source of inspiration and information, as I had the feeling when I first heard that piece in 2004, and then met him again in 2016, and now have had the opportunities to converse again. I hope that that same experience is true for everyone. Kyle?
Terry, thank you for hosting today, co-hosting this with me and Doug, and thank you for your questions, and most of all, thank you, Roger. My goodness, this has been rich. And we would love to continue the conversation with you in the future. I think in this forum, we're also being asked if we can have your contact information. I assume there's an email that we can share with everyone.
Sure, absolutely.
We can send that out. I want to put you, I've heard you sing, we've heard you sing. I would like to put you on the spot and share my screen and let you close us out, and we be muted, myself included, except for you, singing a stanza refrain of "There is a Balm in Gilead." If I could so put you on the spot, and I'll share my screen, but I just thought that would be, as Terry said, this music, these words, these songs mean so much to us, and especially after this session. I think we have a newfound appreciation, and we just appreciate having you lead us in a stanza of that. Give me a moment to share my screen so that we can have the words. Everyone. Sorry, this is a poem I was going to share with y'all, but I'll share it another time. Here we go. Can you see my lyrics, my page?
Yes.
All right. And let me mute myself and everyone make sure they're muted. And Roger will let you begin. And then I'll close this with a prayer, a short prayer.
There is a balm in Gilead to make wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. Sometimes I feel discouraged and think my work's in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul.
Amen. Heavenly Creator, in you we live and move and have our being. We humbly pray you so to guide and govern us by your Holy Spirit, that in all the cares and occupations of this day and in our lives, we may not forget you, but may remember that we are ever walking in your sight and in your light. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Roger.
Peace to all of you.